Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you're enjoying these quiet explorations of the past, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It really does help us keep these gentle stories going. Let me know in the comments, if you like, where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you just now. I always find it comforting to imagine the soft glow of lamps, the rustle of bedclothes, and the hush of winding down, scattered across the world in little moments like this. So now, if you haven't already, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we'll be following the life of a man both celebrated and, in many ways, forgotten. A quiet figure moving at the edge of the limelight, Nikola Tesla, a name now wrapped in myth and modern reinvention, but once just a boy in a rural village in the heart of the 19th century Habsburg Empire. Long before the debates over electricity and invention, before the towers and lightning, he was simply the son of a priest and a gifted mother, born in a modest household under a crackling sky. Tesla's story is often told through flashes of brilliance and bursts of rivalry, but here we'll draw it slowly, as one might sketch the outline of a quiet stream or trace the patterns in old wallpaper. This won't be a tale of triumph or tragedy, not really. It will be one of slow hours in shadowed rooms, of journals filled with calculations and dreams left unspoken. We'll linger over the ordinary, his long walks, his modest meals, the scratch of a pen on paper, as much as the moments of invention. This will be a journey into silence, into the ticking clockwork of a man who lived between two ages, neither fully of the past nor quite of the future. So let's begin with gentle steps. Our first chapter finds us in a mountain village, as a soft rain begins to fall over the thatched rooftops and the distant sound of thunder murmurs its way through the dark. The year was 1856, and the village of Smiljan lay nestled among the soft slopes and shallow valleys of what was then the Austrian Empire, now modern-day Croatia. It was a quiet corner of the world, remote and largely untouched by the wider movements of Europe. The land there was rocky in places, green in others, and laced with footpaths worn by generations of quiet steps. Narrow dirt roads curled past wooden cottages with tiled roofs, and the air often carried the scent of pine and livestock, smoke and freshly turned earth. The sky, especially in summer, had a way of hanging low over the hills, full of cloud and weather. In one of those cottages, near the edge of the village, a child was born in the middle of a storm. The rain came down softly at first, then gathered strength until it was falling in sheets upon the rooftops and fields. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and somewhere close by, thunder cracked with such force it seemed to shake the wooden beams of the house. Within, in a small chamber lit by lamplight and attended only by family, Nikola Tesla entered the world. Stories from his later life would say he was born at midnight during a lightning storm, and that a midwife, perhaps unnerved by the thunder, murmured something about the child being marked by the lightning, to which his mother is said to have replied, gently but firmly, "He will be a child of light." These words, whether truly spoken or simply remembered that way, echoed softly through the rest of his life. But on that night there was no prophecy, no fanfare, just a newborn's cry and the hush of rain on a wooden roof. Tesla's family was of Serbian descent, and they belonged to the Serbian Orthodox Church. His father, Milutin Tesla, was a priest and a writer, given to long sermons and theological rumination. He was a man of letters, known locally for his intelligence and his stern but fair nature. His mother, Georgina, whom most called Juka, had never received formal schooling, yet she possessed a sharp mind and extraordinary memory. She could recite long passages of epic poetry by heart and was known for her skill in crafting household tools, often fashioning them herself from scratch. It was from her that Nikola would later say he inherited his inventive spirit. Their home was not wealthy, but it was warm, structured, and filled with books. Orthodox icons adorned the walls, their candles burning softly in the evenings. Milutin's study smelled of paper and ink, while Juka's kitchen held the comforting aromas of baked bread and wood smoke. Life moved slowly in Smiljan, marked by the rhythms of the seasons and the customs of the church. Days began early and ended with quiet, reflective nights. There were long walks, modest meals, and the ever-present hum of village life. The clink of buckets at the well, the creak of carts over stone, the lowing of cattle returning at dusk. From an early age, Nikola was different. He was pale, slight, and intensely inward. His eyes, often described as a piercing blue-grey, had a way of drifting off into some unseen distance, as though watching something just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. He rarely played in the manner of other children, and when he did, it was often alone, constructing intricate contraptions from bits of wood, string, and metal. He would spend hours lost in his own world, spinning wheels and imagining machines, his small hands moving with surprising precision. At night, long before he could read, he would listen as his father read aloud, passages from the Bible, sermons, and sometimes Homeric epics. The rhythms of language fascinated him. He began to memorize phrases, to repeat them in the dark. Words settled in him, quietly, like seeds in soil. But it was his mother's influence that seems to have shaped the deeper habits of his mind. Watching her work with her hands, solve practical problems with intuition and invention, planted a quiet conviction in him that anything could be built if only one thought hard enough and long enough. She never needed to say it aloud. It was in the way she moved through the kitchen, fixed broken tools, or designed a new spindle for spinning wool. It was in her calm, deliberate gestures. The family, though devout, did not impose their beliefs on him. Rather, faith was simply a texture of daily life. Icons watched silently from the corners of rooms, and prayers came as naturally as the morning light. Tesla, later in life, would diverge from many of these teachings, growing more drawn to the language of science and the quiet metaphysics of numbers and energy. But those early years shaped his inner world deeply, giving it a rhythm and reverence that would remain. Outside the walls of the house, the village carried on as it always had. Seasons turned gently, one into another. In winter, snow lay thick over the rooftops, muffling sound and slowing the pace of life to a near halt. Families huddled around fires, telling stories and preparing for the lean months. In spring, the fields came alive again, and the sound of water flowing from the hills filled the air. Church bells marked the hours, the days, the holy days. There was little in the way of excitement, but also little in the way of disruption. Yet, even as a child, Nikola was restless. Not in movement, but in mind. He would later write of strange visions that came to him, often unbidden, flashes of light, floating images, numbers and wheels and spirals. He found them overwhelming, at times frightening, but also fascinating. He began to try and control them, to harness them in service of ideas. He developed a powerful imagination, able to construct devices in his mind, rotate them, refine them, all without needing to build a physical model. It was a gift, but also a burden. As he grew, his health became fragile. He suffered from frequent illnesses and peculiar sensitivities, especially to light and sound. He heard things others didn't, felt vibrations others missed. The world, for him, seemed louder, sharper, more insistent, but rather than shy from it, he absorbed it all. His memory grew prodigious. He could recall entire books, replicate diagrams from a single glance, and still, he was quiet. He preferred solitude, the company of his thoughts, the feel of the cold wind against his face on long walks. His older brother Dane was bright too, perhaps even brighter, and the two were close. But tragedy would visit the family when Nikola was just 5. Dane died in a riding accident, an event that cast a long, quiet shadow over the household. It shook the family to its core. Milutin and Georgina grieved deeply, though inwardly, and Nikola, in his own small way, must have felt some shift, some change in the texture of love and attention. He never spoke of it in great detail, but some say it marked the beginning of his deeper retreat into the inner world of thought and invention. And so his early years drifted on, under the low sky of Smiljan, between the pages of books, the rhythm of prayers, and the clatter of simple tools. A boy set slightly apart, not by force, but by nature. A child of light indeed, though more candle than lightning, quiet, flickering, constant. The village of Smiljan, though small and unassuming, held within its quiet boundaries a depth of life that was not immediately apparent to the outsider. In those years following Nikola's early childhood, the rhythms of rural life continued much as they had for centuries. There were harvests to tend, animals to raise, and tools to mend. Each day unfurled like a scroll written in the same careful hand, slow and steady, with the kind of predictability that brought comfort to those who lived by the land. By the time Nikola was a young boy, he had begun to distinguish himself, not only in his mind, but in his daily habits. He would often rise early, slipping out of the family home before the sun had cleared the hills. The paths through the village were still in shadow at that hour, the dew wet on the grass, the stones cool beneath his feet. He walked without urgency, taking in the sounds of birdsong, the rustle of trees, and the distant lowing of cattle. These quiet mornings seemed to belong to him alone. It was during these walks that his sense of observation sharpened. He noted the way water flowed over pebbles, the way smoke curled from chimneys, the fluttering patterns of leaves in the wind. Such details lodged themselves in his memory with curious clarity. He seemed to store them away, not only as impressions but as mechanisms, little systems that spoke of balance and repetition. Long before he had any formal understanding of physics, he intuited it in the way the world moved. His schooling began at the local primary school, a modest building where the desks were worn smooth by generations of pupils. The master was a stern man, but not unkind, and he soon noticed the unusual capacities of his young student. Nikola absorbed lessons with quiet intensity. His handwriting was delicate, his speech formal, and his answers precise. While other children squirmed and whispered, he sat still, eyes forward, mind clearly elsewhere. He excelled particularly in mathematics, where numbers seemed to dance before him with a logic that required no explanation. Arithmetic problems were solved almost before they were spoken, and geometry unfolded for him as naturally as the curves of the surrounding hills. But he also showed interest in languages, and before long had a working knowledge of German, which was the administrative tongue of the region, alongside his native Serbian and Croatian. He read widely, often beyond the curriculum, borrowing books whenever he could, and sometimes copying passages longhand just to keep them close. Though bright, he was never boastful. His manner remained quiet, almost shy, and he often kept to himself during breaks. He would sometimes watch the other children at play, smiling softly, but rarely joining in. On occasion, he would tinker with small inventions, simple toys that moved or made noise, curious little contraptions fashioned from wire, string, and scraps of wood. These amused his classmates, but they seldom understood the workings behind them. To them, they were magic. To Nikola, they were simply reflections of what he saw in the world. His home life remained rooted in the same gentle regularity. Milutin continued his duties as a priest, conducting services and writing theological reflections, while Georgina maintained the household with quiet efficiency. Nikola watched her as she worked, still fascinated by her intuitive understanding of practical design. She once made a mechanical egg beater from bits of wood and metal, and he studied it for days, admiring its simplicity and effectiveness. Evenings were spent in lamplight. The family gathered around the fire, reading or mending. Occasionally, neighbors would visit, and stories would be told. Legends of saints, tales from the old country, anecdotes passed down through generations. Nikola listened intently, storing the cadences and details as though they too were part of some deeper order. He was particularly drawn to stories that featured invention or cleverness, tricksters who outwitted kings, monks who built curious devices, ancient scholars who saw the stars not only as points of light, but as instruments. One small detail of these years stands out in many accounts: the way Nikola dealt with illness. He was, even then, frequently unwell. He suffered from recurring fevers, headaches, and fainting spells. These were not merely physical afflictions, but seemed tied to his sensitivity to stimuli. Bright lights would overwhelm him, sudden noises would cause distress, and he claimed, even then, to see flashes of light when thinking intensely. At times his parents feared for his health, unsure whether his condition was physical, mental, or some strange combination of both. But he recovered again and again, often retreating into silence during these spells. He would lie still for hours, eyes closed, and when he emerged, it was with new clarity. He claimed to see solutions during these quiet convalescences, to watch in his mind as machines unfolded and operated, each part moving in harmony. It was as though the fever unshackled his imagination, giving him access to visions that the waking world could not provide. As he moved into adolescence, the village began to seem smaller. He longed for books he couldn't find, for experiments he couldn't conduct, for teachers who could answer questions that even his father struggled to understand. He began to write letters to distant institutions, requesting publications, technical manuals, anything that might feed the growing hunger of his mind. Some arrived, months later, in battered envelopes from cities he had never seen: Vienna, Budapest, even Paris. He read them with quiet reverence. But the future was uncertain. His father hoped he would follow in his footsteps, entering the priesthood and taking on the life of service and scholarship that had shaped their family. Milutin saw the church not as a restriction, but as a structure, something within which a man could think deeply and act honorably. But Nikola, though respectful, hesitated. His interests were drifting further and further from the theological and ever deeper into the mechanical. A compromise at first was imagined. Perhaps he could study both, or become a teacher of technical subjects within the church. But already a quiet resistance had begun to form within him, not rebellious, but firm. He dreamed of machines, of energy, of unseen forces. He wanted to travel, to learn in the great cities, to work not with words, but with wires and wheels and waves. Still, those ambitions remained largely unspoken during these years. He kept them folded within, like letters not yet posted. For now he remained a son of Smiljan, a boy of the village, walking its quiet lanes beneath the vast Carpathian sky, his thoughts trailing far beyond the horizon. By the time Nikola Tesla reached his late teenage years, the paths that had crisscrossed his childhood, the foot-worn trails through Smiljan, the quiet corridors of local schools, and the sun-dappled places where he had first glimpsed the mechanics of the world, began to narrow. A new path lay ahead, one that would lead far from the village hills and into the more formal, often unforgiving world of academic life. Though it came with a sense of promise, it also brought unease, as if the rhythm of his earlier days had been replaced by something sharper, more insistent. The journey to Graz, in what was then the Austrian Empire, marked Tesla's first true step beyond the familiar. He was sent to attend the Imperial Royal Technical College, an institution well regarded for its emphasis on engineering and the sciences. The city itself was a world apart from Smiljan. Its streets were broader, its buildings taller, and its life more hurried. There were carriages on cobblestones, gas lights in the evenings, and the constant din of urban life. Sounds that Tesla, with his sensitive ears, found both fascinating and fatiguing. Graz was not unkind, but it was unfamiliar. And for Tesla, that unfamiliarity brought with it a kind of quiet isolation. He lodged modestly, often in rooms shared with other students or tucked away above shops, where the smell of ink and oil mingled with the smell of bread. He kept to a strict routine, rising early to study, walking alone to lectures, and returning late to his books. His peers remembered him as intense, if distant. He rarely engaged in idle conversation, and seemed to eat more out of necessity than enjoyment, sometimes forgetting meals altogether in the midst of a calculation or thought. The curriculum in Graz was rigorous. Tesla immersed himself in the study of physics, mathematics, and mechanical engineering, and he soon became known for his extraordinary memory and ability to visualize complex machinery in his mind. He did not sketch like others did. His diagrams were internal, precise, and vivid. This mental method, which he had begun to develop as a child, now matured into a kind of personal philosophy. He believed that an idea should be perfected mentally before ever being put to paper or material. Yet, for all his talent, his time in Graz was not without difficulty. The expectations were high, and the demands relentless. The pace of lectures, examinations, and practical work wore at his health and his spirit. Tesla, who already struggled with periods of nervous exhaustion, began to drift between brilliance and breakdown. There were days when he worked without pause, pushing himself through nights with only brief, dreamless sleep. And there were other days when his mind grew cloudy, when the noise of the city and the pressure of expectations pressed heavily upon him. It was also during this time that Tesla developed a fascination with the Gram dynamo, an early electrical generator that could also function as a motor. He studied its operation obsessively, noting its inefficiencies, and quietly began to imagine a new kind of motor. One without brushes or commutators, one powered not by direct current, but by an alternating current that pulsed with rhythmic symmetry. The idea, though still embryonic, would eventually grow into one of his greatest contributions. But in Graz it remained unspoken, a thought waiting in the wings. Tesla also struggled with a growing conflict between his inner world and the external demands of academic life. He was never careless, but he found the rigidity of exams and rote learning stifling. He wanted to explore, to ask questions that had no place in the syllabus. This tension eventually reached a breaking point. After a few years, his attendance became erratic. Though he had once excelled, he began to miss classes, fall behind on assignments, and retreat further into his private thoughts. By the end of his time in Graz, he had not graduated, and worse, had concealed his academic decline from his family. In the wake of this quiet failure, Tesla drifted. He left Graz and moved to Maribor, a smaller town where he took up work as a draftsman. It was a modest position, far from the lofty expectations his family had once held for him. He lived frugally, walking long distances each day and reading whatever he could find. He was, for a time, directionless. Letters to his father went unanswered or were filled with omissions. He spoke little of this period later in life, but it was clear that it marked a time of confusion and self-doubt. Eventually, news of his situation reached home, and Milutin, concerned and saddened, begged his son to resume his studies. Tesla relented and agreed to enroll at Charles Ferdinand University in Prague. By then, his father was unwell, and perhaps Tesla's return to education was as much a gesture of filial duty as it was an academic pursuit. He arrived in Prague in 1880, but once again the structure of formal learning chafed against his instincts. He attended lectures in physics and philosophy, but without official registration, he could not sit for exams. And within the year, his father passed away. Tesla was 24. The death of Milutin was a quiet blow, less dramatic than the death of his brother, but deeper in its implications. The man who had first introduced him to language and books, who had prayed over his bedside and walked beside him in the meadows of Smiljan, was gone, and with him any remaining tie to the path of theology or home. Tesla, already a man of few attachments, now found himself even more alone. Still, something shifted within him. Perhaps the passing of his father brought with it a new clarity, or perhaps it simply marked the end of one chapter and the hesitant beginning of another. In the years to come, Tesla would carry with him the lessons of Graz and Prague, not as triumphs, but as quiet turning points. They had shown him the cost of genius, the burden of expectation, and the loneliness of a mind that moved differently. He left Prague not with a degree, but with a growing vision. Somewhere, amidst the fog of failure and grief, a purpose had begun to take shape. He would go on to pursue that purpose in the laboratories and cities of Europe, and later, America. But those early academic years, so often overlooked, had left their mark. They had taught him that brilliance alone was not enough, that the world would not bend easily to ideas, that sometimes the mind must first weather solitude before it can shape the future. By the early 1880s, Tesla found himself drawn into a world where invention was no longer a quiet act of reflection, but a public spectacle, where wires snaked across city streets and the hum of machines marked the beginning of a new industrial age. Having drifted between cities and jobs following his time in Prague, he secured a position with the Continental Edison Company in Paris, a significant if understated development in his winding path. The company, linked to the American inventor Thomas Edison, was expanding rapidly, and Tesla's engineering talents, though still relatively unknown, quickly caught the attention of his supervisors. Paris at that time was a city of light in more than just the metaphorical sense. Gas lamps still glowed across much of the city, but electricity was beginning to creep in, replacing the hiss of flame with the buzz of current. Tesla, now in his late 20s, entered this shifting world quietly, joining a team responsible for installing and maintaining electrical systems. He was not yet the visionary of headlines, but an employee, diligent and precise, his thoughts often straying beyond the tasks at hand. His work involved troubleshooting and redesigning direct current DC systems, the standard promoted by Edison himself. Tesla applied himself thoroughly, learning not only the practical workings of generators and motors, but the shortcomings as well, chief among them the inefficiencies of transmitting DC over long distances. These flaws only deepened his growing conviction that alternating current, AC, with its ability to oscillate and carry energy more efficiently, was the future. But in Paris, these thoughts remained largely his own. He kept to himself as he had in earlier years, rising early, working late, often dining alone. His colleagues regarded him as both brilliant and unusual, polite but aloof, with a mind that never seemed to settle. He would spend his free hours sketching ideas, reworking designs in his notebook, and taking long walks through the city's quieter quarters, where the buzz of electrical transition felt less immediate. Then came an opportunity. In 1884, Tesla was invited to travel to the United States to work directly for Edison. The invitation was not from Edison himself, but from Charles Batchelor, a manager who had observed Tesla's skill and believed he could be useful in New York. Tesla accepted the offer, though not without hesitation. He was leaving behind not just Europe, but the familiar cadences of language, landscape, and pace. Still, he boarded the ship Servia with little more than a suitcase, some letters of introduction, and a head full of half-finished thoughts. The journey across the Atlantic was long and at times turbulent. Tesla, unaccustomed to sea travel, fell ill. A few of his possessions were stolen during the voyage, leaving him with even less than he had started with. Yet he arrived in New York with a sense of cautious resolve. The city that greeted him was unlike anything he had known, loud, crowded, vertical, and endlessly moving. Steam rose from grates, streetcars clanged along tracks, and the skyline, though modest by later standards, already reached for the clouds. He presented himself at Edison's office, reportedly handing over Batchelor's letter with the quiet dignity of someone who had much to offer, but little interest in proving it. Edison, who preferred practical men to theoreticians, was initially skeptical. Tesla's European manner, his formal speech and contemplative gaze contrasted sharply with Edison's own brusque, hands-on style. Yet Tesla was hired, set to work, improving Edison's DC generators, machines that powered parts of the city and symbolized the inventor's growing empire. Tesla worked diligently, often through the night, refining designs, correcting faults, and suggesting improvements. His results were significant enough that Edison reportedly promised him a large bonus if he could succeed in redesigning key components for greater efficiency. Tesla, ever meticulous, set about the task with characteristic thoroughness and eventually delivered a solution that surpassed expectations. But when he inquired about the promised reward, Edison dismissed it, allegedly saying something to the effect of, "You don't understand our American humor." Whether the words were truly spoken in jest or were simply a deflection remains unclear. What is certain is that Tesla felt betrayed. The incident marked a quiet turning point, the beginning of a fissure between the two men, a rift not born of confrontation, but of fundamental difference in temperament and philosophy. Tesla was not a businessman. He did not think in terms of patents or profits. His mind lingered on symmetry, on the flow of energy, on patterns seen in dreams and daydreams. Edison, by contrast, was a pragmatist, grounded in trial and error, determined to bring workable products to market by whatever means necessary. The two men occupied the same industry, but entirely different worlds. Disillusioned, Tesla left Edison's company. For a time, he found himself in poverty. He worked as a laborer, digging ditches for $1 a day. The work was hard and the days long. Yet even during this period, he continued to think, to imagine. His mind never ceased its movement, sketching machines not in ink, but in thought, testing theories as he worked silently beneath the open sky. It was during this period that Tesla began to speak more openly about his vision for alternating current. He had not yet built a working motor, but the principle was clear in his mind. A motor that used rotating magnetic fields, powered by alternating current, without the need for brushes or commutators. The concept was elegant and, in his eyes, inevitable. But to others, especially those entrenched in Edison's DC systems, it seemed speculative, even dangerous. Eventually, Tesla secured the interest of investors willing to support his ideas. He was given a modest laboratory and the means to build a prototype. What followed was a period of intense, quiet work. He moved with care, assembling parts, testing coils, refining his calculations. In 1888, he demonstrated his AC motor before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers. The audience, composed of some of the brightest minds in the field, was impressed. His system was simple, scalable, and remarkably efficient. Shortly thereafter, George Westinghouse, a businessman and inventor in his own right, acquired Tesla's patents and offered him a position. With Westinghouse's support, Tesla's vision for AC would gain traction, setting the stage for what would come to be known, though never loudly spoken of at the time, as the War of Currents. But in those early days in New York, before the towers and the fame, Tesla was simply a man walking through unfamiliar streets, burdened by invention, quietly seeking a place to build something that would outlast him. In the later months of 1888, having secured the backing of George Westinghouse and the formal recognition of his alternating current patents, Tesla at last found himself in possession of something he had long lacked: space. Not simply physical space, though the laboratory he established in Manhattan afforded plenty of that, but mental space too. For the first time in his adult life, he was free to work without the suffocating constraints of an overseer's agenda or the need to labor for mere subsistence. It was a modest freedom, to be sure, but to Tesla it was everything. The laboratory stood at 33 South Fifth Avenue, later renamed West Broadway, in a district of New York that was then still in transition. The building itself was unremarkable, a narrow, multi-story structure with soot-darkened brick and tall windows that allowed light to flood the interior by day. At night, the place glowed with gas lamps and later electrical fixtures of Tesla's own design, their bluish hum an ever-present background to the quiet activity within. He kept irregular hours. More often than not, he worked well past midnight, sometimes until dawn, his tall, lean frame silhouetted against a desk of schematics and coils. He would stand motionless for long minutes, sometimes hours, visualizing a device in his mind before lifting a tool. When he did move, it was with great economy, unhurried, deliberate, as though each gesture had already been rehearsed countless times in silence. Tesla's habits by then were already eccentric. He rarely ate in the company of others, preferring simple meals alone, and he was unusually fastidious about cleanliness, washing his hands frequently and avoiding unnecessary physical contact. He claimed to sleep only 2 hours a night, though this may have been part exaggeration, part truth. What is certain is that he worked in long, uninterrupted stretches, driven not by deadline but by an inner compulsion that seemed equal parts devotion and necessity. His laboratory became a kind of refuge, a sanctuary where the noise of the outside world, its commerce, its competitions, its harsh pragmatisms, could not easily intrude. Here, Tesla's imagination was allowed to roam. He experimented with high-frequency currents, wireless transmission, vacuum tubes, and novel lighting systems. He constructed strange devices, many of which emitted brilliant flashes of light or deep, resonant tones that echoed through the building's walls and floors, causing consternation among neighbors and occasional visits from curious policemen. Among his earliest breakthroughs during this period was the refinement of the Tesla coil, a resonant transformer circuit capable of producing high-voltage, low-current, high-frequency alternating current electricity. To Tesla, the coil was more than a tool. It was a symbol of untapped potential. He used it to explore the transmission of energy without wires, believing that one day power could be distributed across vast distances, freely through the air itself. Visitors to the lab, few though they were, often left with a mix of awe and bewilderment. Tesla would demonstrate devices that sparked and glowed, sending arcs of blue lightning crackling through the air. He took pains to explain their operation, though his quiet, accented English and softly technical phrasing often left his audience grasping only the broadest outlines. Still, the impression he left was indelible. Tall, elegant, poised, and possessed of a mind unlike any they had encountered. He kept notebooks filled with diagrams and careful prose, written in a fine, upright hand. Pages described devices not yet built, phenomena not yet understood. Many of these ideas would never be realized, and not for lack of merit. Tesla's visions often outpaced the materials and methods of his time. He foresaw wireless communication, remote control, even a form of radar, all decades before they would become practical realities. But in 1889, such foresight brought little in the way of recognition or reward. Outside the lab, Tesla led a mostly solitary life. He maintained a small number of acquaintances, including a few businessmen, journalists, and fellow engineers, but he seemed most at ease in solitude. Occasionally, he would take long walks through the city, favoring quiet streets and the sound of distant horse hooves on cobbles. He found beauty in symmetry and habit, often dining at the same table in the same restaurant, ordering the same meal, always with precise timing and measured courtesy. Though quiet, he was not entirely removed from public life. As his work gained notice, he began to give lectures, first to small audiences, later to larger gatherings. These were carefully prepared, filled with demonstrations that bordered on theatrical. Tesla, though not naturally flamboyant, understood the power of spectacle. He would stand before a crowd, coil in hand, arcs of electricity crackling across his body, calm and unflinching. It was a controlled display, meant not to dazzle, but to suggest a future where such forces could be tamed, directed, and made useful. Yet despite growing fame, Tesla remained financially vulnerable. His agreement with Westinghouse, though generous at first, would later be renegotiated under pressure from the financial backers of the Westinghouse company. They feared that Tesla's royalty arrangement, based on each horsepower of AC motor sold, could eventually cost them vast sums. In a gesture both noble and naive, Tesla agreed to dissolve the royalty clause, sacrificing what could have been a great fortune in exchange for the company's continued survival and the spread of his AC system. Such decisions marked Tesla not as a businessman, but as a man of vision, one who prized the realization of ideas above their monetization. He saw invention not as a path to wealth, but as a sacred calling, a way of uncovering the subtle harmonies of nature and translating them into forms that others might use, even if they did not understand them. In those years on South Fifth Avenue, long before the setbacks that would follow, Tesla lived as close to his ideal as he ever would. Each evening, he returned to the lab not to escape the world, but to shape it, quietly, patiently, one experiment at a time. As the 1890s unfurled across the American landscape, it brought with it a new kind of contest, not of armies or ideologies, but of wires and voltages, of systems and standards. The question at its core was deceptively simple. How should electricity be delivered to homes and businesses? But behind it lay deeper tensions, commercial, technical, and, in quieter ways, personal. It was a rivalry often recounted with drama in later years, but at the time it moved with a kind of industrial inevitability, its battles fought not with fire and noise, but with contracts, demonstrations, and the steady hum of dynamos. At the heart of this struggle were two opposing visions. One belonged to Thomas Edison, whose direct current, or DC system, was already in use across parts of New York and other urban centers. DC was reliable over short distances, but suffered significant energy losses the further it traveled. Edison's vision was rooted in the close, manageable geography of cities, where power stations could be built every mile or so to sustain the network. The other vision, quieter but no less determined, came from Tesla. His alternating current, or AC system, backed by George Westinghouse, allowed electricity to be transmitted over much greater distances with minimal loss. It used transformers to step voltage up for long-distance travel and down for safe use in homes and factories. Where Edison saw complication and danger, Tesla saw symmetry and potential. Though Tesla himself did not relish confrontation, the conflict that followed, soon dubbed the War of Currents, became a defining chapter of his career. It was fought largely through public demonstrations and printed words. Edison, wary of the threat to his DC system, embarked on a campaign to discredit AC. His company financed articles and pamphlets warning of the dangers of high-voltage currents. He arranged for public electrocutions of animals, using AC to show its lethal potential, a spectacle that left Tesla deeply uneasy. One of the most controversial episodes came with the development of the electric chair. Edison's associates supported its use as a way to demonstrate the risks of alternating current. In 1890, the first execution was carried out using AC, a moment meant to turn public opinion against Tesla's system. But the event was botched and gruesome, its violence casting a long, grim shadow. For Tesla, who saw electricity as a force of progress and harmony, the use of his principles in such a way was profoundly disturbing. He said little publicly, but privately he recoiled. Meanwhile, Westinghouse continued to push forward with AC installations. Factories, streetlights, and residential areas began to convert. Engineers recognized the system's efficiency and, more importantly, its economy. A single power station, equipped with transformers, could serve a wide area at lower cost. The tide, slowly, was turning. Tesla, ever the quiet center of these developments, remained in his laboratory through much of the dispute. He was not a man of campaigns or pamphlets. He did not give interviews attacking Edison or attend demonstrations to sway opinion. Instead, he continued refining his systems, perfecting his motors, developing more stable oscillators. His contributions were not loud but constant, and the elegance of his designs spoke for themselves. Recognition came gradually. In 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago offered a chance to showcase the AC system on a grand scale. Westinghouse won the contract to illuminate the fairgrounds, and Tesla's technology was chosen to power the event. When night fell over the White City and hundreds of thousands of incandescent bulbs flickered to life in unison, powered by Tesla's polyphase system, the effect was breathtaking. Visitors walked among the exhibits as if under a man-made firmament, their faces lit with wonder. The fair marked a turning point. A C had not only arrived, it had triumphed. Later that same year, Westinghouse secured the contract to build the power station at Niagara Falls, using Tesla's system to harness the energy of the Great River. It was, in many ways, the culmination of Tesla's early vision: natural power converted, transmitted, and distributed cleanly and efficiently. By 1896, electricity from Niagara was lighting Buffalo over 20 miles away, a feat that would have been impossible with Edison's DC system. Yet for all this success, Tesla remained a somewhat distant figure. He accepted accolades politely, but without flourish. He declined opportunities for personal wealth, often choosing to reinvest his earnings into new experiments. Even as his name became more widely known, he did not seek fame. If anything, the growing noise around his work seemed to drive him deeper into solitude. His relationship with Edison, meanwhile, remained largely unspoken. They did not meet often, nor did they engage directly in debate. Their rivalry was more one of ideas than personalities. Edison, grounded in practicality, focused on what worked now. Tesla, more idealistic, focused on what could work tomorrow. They moved in parallel, rarely touching, yet always aware of the other's path. And so, the War of Currents came to a close, not with a decisive blow, but with a slow, undeniable shift. A C became the standard. Edison's DC, while still useful in niche applications, gradually receded from prominence. Tesla's vision, once doubted and dismissed, had proven itself not through spectacle, but through silent endurance. In the quiet of his laboratory, Tesla returned to his coils and currents, to the flicker of arc lamps and the gentle hum of oscillators. He made no grand declarations, gave no victory speeches. For him, the work continued. There were still patterns to decipher, forces to understand. The world had begun to turn in his direction, yes, but Tesla, as ever, was already looking elsewhere. The close of the 19th century found Nikola Tesla in a peculiar position. His name was now known among engineers, his systems widely adopted, and his reputation as an inventor quietly solidifying. Yet rather than bask in the modest glow of recognition or consolidate his achievements, he turned his gaze further afield. For Tesla, success was never an endpoint, but a platform from which to climb higher, to reach toward phenomena not yet fully understood, and to construct devices not yet fully imagined. Among his growing preoccupations was the idea of wireless transmission, not merely of sound or signals, though those would come, but of power itself. He envisioned a world in which energy could be conveyed through the air, unhindered by wires, poles, or boundaries. The idea, though fantastic to many, struck Tesla as an extension of principles already demonstrated: the resonance of electrical circuits, the propagation of waves, the behavior of electromagnetic fields. If tuned correctly, he believed, these forces could be harnessed, guided, and distributed across the globe. It began with modest experiments. At his laboratory on East Houston Street in Manhattan, Tesla constructed increasingly powerful oscillators, devices that produced high-frequency electrical currents. These were not merely instruments of measurement, but tools for probing the invisible structures of energy. When operated, they emitted humming tones, flashes of violet light, and occasional bursts that startled passers-by and prompted visits from the police. Tesla, ever composed, would explain the nature of the work in calm tones, though few truly grasped the full extent of his intent. In 1898, at Madison Square Garden, he demonstrated something quietly revolutionary: a small boat, guided remotely by radio signals. It moved across a shallow indoor pool, its motions directed by Tesla at a distance, the control hidden within a box that he manipulated with subtle movements of his fingers. The audience, unsure what to make of the spectacle, assumed trickery, but Tesla patiently explained the principles at work: how the boat responded not to wires or visible cues, but to electromagnetic signals sent invisibly through the air. What they witnessed was, in essence, the birth of remote control. But for Tesla, it was not the end, merely a beginning. If signals could be transmitted, why not power? If devices could be operated from afar, why not illuminated, energized, sustained? He wrote extensively during these years, publishing articles and giving lectures that hinted at a global system of wireless energy. He envisioned towers that would resonate with the Earth's natural frequencies, broadcasting power like a universal heartbeat, accessible from any point on the planet. Lamps would light without wires. Ships would cross oceans guided by wireless beacons. Clocks would keep time not from springs or pendulums, but from signals received from a central transmitter. To many, these were dreams, but Tesla approached them not as fantasies, but as problems to be solved. He drew schematics, calculated resonances, tested antennas. He spoke often of the Earth itself as a conductor, of the ionosphere as a reflective boundary, of standing waves that could be set in motion around the globe. Amidst these explorations, Tesla's laboratory burned. In March of 1895, a fire broke out in the early hours, consuming his Houston Street workspace in a matter of hours. Years of notebooks, models, instruments, and personal items were lost. He arrived at the scene too late to intervene, standing silently as flames climbed the walls and smoke drifted into the dawn. He spoke little of the loss, but it marked him. There was no outburst, no public mourning, just a brief statement to the press and a quiet return to work. The setback, though severe, did not deter him. Within months, he had secured a new laboratory, this time at 46 to 48 East Houston Street, and resumed his experiments. He worked with renewed urgency, perhaps aware that the world around him was shifting, that the age of lone inventors was giving way to larger corporate laboratories, and that ideas, however noble, could be eclipsed by matters of finance and fashion. Even so, his evenings remained much the same. He continued to dine alone at Delmonico's or the Waldorf Astoria, always at the same hour, always at the same table. Waiters grew accustomed to his preferences, to the exact temperature of his soup, the precise arrangement of his silverware. He dressed immaculately, favoring tailored suits, always pressed and pristine. To the casual observer, he appeared a man of means and method, untouched by failure or fatigue. Yet within, the pressure of his ambitions weighed heavily. He became increasingly preoccupied with patterns and numbers, particularly the numbers 3, 6, and 9, which he believed held special significance. He walked around buildings 3 times before entering, washed his hands in multiples, arranged his work and rest according to sequences that few others understood. These habits, sometimes seen as signs of eccentricity, were to Tesla matters of harmony, a way to align himself with the deeper rhythms he believed underpinned the universe. In his writing, he spoke often of energy, frequency, and vibration. These were, to him, the fundamental components of all matter and motion. He believed that if one could understand the resonant frequency of an object, or indeed the planet itself, one could influence it profoundly. This belief guided not only his technical work but his worldview. He saw humanity not as separate from nature, but as participants in a vast, intricate system, an electrical symphony in which each thought, each action was a note. It was during these years, too, that Tesla began to speak of communication with other worlds. He believed that, through his wireless systems, it might be possible to detect signals from intelligent beings beyond the Earth. These ideas were met with skepticism, even derision, by the press, who found in them a source of caricature. But Tesla, unperturbed, continued his work, confident that time would prove him right. As the century turned, He stood poised at the edge of what he hoped would be a new era, one in which wireless transmission would bind continents, light cities, and elevate civilization. He had no way of knowing that the most ambitious phase of his life was about to begin, nor that it would test not only his intellect but his endurance, his finances, and his place in history. For now, he returned to his coils and circuits, to the quiet hum of oscillators and the scratch of a pen across paper, dreaming still of a world without wires, where energy moved unseen across the sky, and where the distant horizon offered not an end, but a beginning. In the summer of 1899, Nikola Tesla left the dense streets of New York behind and journeyed westward to the quiet expanses of Colorado Springs. He arrived not with pomp or entourage, but with crates of equipment, notebooks filled with diagrams, and a single, steadfast purpose: to continue his investigations into wireless transmission, high-voltage currents, and the deeper principles of resonance that he believed governed the natural world. Colorado, with its dry air, frequent electrical storms, and relative isolation, offered ideal conditions for such work. The town itself was modest, situated at the base of the Rocky Mountains, with wide, dusty streets and a slower pace of life. Locals watched with mild curiosity as Tesla established his laboratory on the edge of town, an unassuming wooden structure surrounded by open prairie, its roof topped with a large copper sphere mounted on a tall mast. To some, it looked like an observatory; to others, a barn with ambitions. Inside, the laboratory was a careful arrangement of coils, transformers, capacitors, and arc gaps. Tesla moved through it with silent precision, adjusting knobs, tightening screws, and occasionally stepping back to observe, as though the machines were living things whose moods needed interpreting. He worked long hours, often into the small hours of the morning, pausing only to scribble notes in his journals or to walk alone along the ridges outside town, coat buttoned against the wind, mind filled with currents and waveforms. The heart of his work in Colorado Springs was the study of the Earth's natural resonances, what he believed to be the fundamental frequencies at which the planet itself vibrated. He theorized that if one could generate electrical oscillations tuned to these frequencies, it would be possible to send energy around the globe, unobstructed, and even draw power directly from the Earth's electrical envelope. To test this, he built ever larger coils, culminating in a massive magnifying transmitter, a variant of his Tesla coil designed to produce extremely high voltages. The device emitted arcs of electricity that stretched several feet, and when it was activated at full capacity, it produced thunderous discharges that lit the room with flashes of purple and blue light. Witnesses recalled that sparks leapt from the ground, that bulbs held near the laboratory would glow without wires, and that the crackling could be heard for miles. One of the most striking experiments occurred during a thunderstorm. Tesla connected his equipment to a specially built antenna and claimed to detect unusual rhythmic signals. He speculated that these might not be natural in origin, that they could in fact be transmissions from another planet, while later explanations pointed to terrestrial sources or instrumental anomalies. Tesla remained convinced that the signals bore the hallmarks of intelligent design. The idea never left him entirely. Despite the scale of his experiments, Tesla remained a quiet, respectful presence in the community. He lodged modestly, took solitary meals, and conversed politely when approached. Local children, drawn to the mysterious hum of the laboratory, would sometimes gather nearby, hoping to catch a glimpse of the silent sparks or to hear the deep, resonant tones that echoed from within. Tesla, aware of their curiosity, maintained a gentle distance, neither encouraging nor discouraging their interest. He wrote frequently during this time, filling notebooks with observations, calculations, and philosophical reflections. In these pages, one finds a man both deeply focused and quietly philosophical, concerned not only with the mechanics of energy, but with its place in the broader tapestry of life. He spoke of nature as a grand conductor, of energy as a binding force, of invention as a moral duty rather than a commercial enterprise. Yet for all the ambition and beauty of his work, practical results remained elusive. His transmissions traveled distances, yes, but not with the reliability or clarity required for widespread adoption. And while he succeeded in demonstrating wireless illumination, the energy needed to sustain such systems remained immense, the infrastructure daunting. Still, Tesla believed. He saw each experiment not as an endpoint, but as a necessary step on a longer road. By the end of his stay in Colorado Springs, Tesla had exhausted much of his funding. The laboratory, battered by repeated tests and local storms, showed signs of wear. His equipment, once gleaming, now bore the marks of fire and corrosion. But the data he gathered, the voltages measured, the waveforms recorded, the patterns observed, would inform his next and most ambitious undertaking. In early 1900, Tesla packed his instruments, closed the laboratory, and returned to New York. He left behind not a failed venture, but a quiet field of possibility, lines drawn in the dust, coils half buried in soil, and the faint memory of thunder rolling across the prairie, not from storm, but from a single silent man searching the skies for resonance. Upon his return to New York at the turn of the new century, Tesla carried with him not only the data from his Colorado Springs experiments, but a renewed sense of purpose. The vision that had guided him through years of quiet labor now took tangible form in a new and monumental undertaking, one that would dominate the next chapter of his life. He called it Wardenclyffe, and it was to be the first of many towers, vast, resonant structures designed to transmit wireless energy and communication across the globe. The dream, as always, was one of universal benefit, free energy, accessible to all, broadcast through the air as effortlessly as radio waves. The project was sited in Shoreham, Long Island, a quiet coastal village where the sea met land in slow, lapping rhythms. There, amid fields and sandy soil, Tesla commissioned the construction of his most ambitious laboratory yet, a complex of low-slung buildings surrounding a wooden tower, nearly 200 feet tall, crowned by a bulbous steel dome. From a distance, the structure seemed almost nautical, like a lighthouse turned inward, watching not the ocean but the invisible tides of the sky. Construction began in 1901, financed in part by J. Pierpont Morgan, the financier and industrial magnate. Morgan, intrigued by the potential of wireless communication, particularly its commercial applications in transatlantic messaging, had agreed to fund Tesla with $150,000, a considerable sum, though well short of what would ultimately be needed. The agreement was never fully documented, but it was understood by both men that Tesla would develop a global system for wireless telegraphy. Tesla, in turn, hoped that Morgan's interest might expand to include his broader dream of wireless power. The tower rose slowly, plank by plank, its frame assembled with great care by local laborers. Tesla visited often, inspecting the progress with a calm but constant presence. He wore his customary suit, even amid the dust and timber, and moved through the site with the bearing of someone who already saw the completed vision in his mind. Beneath the tower he had a deep well dug, not for water, but to house a grounding system he believed essential for transmitting energy through the earth itself. The laboratory building, too, was carefully arranged. Its floors were swept daily, its instruments laid out with precision. Tesla took pride in the order of things. He believed that cleanliness and structure were not mere habits, but expressions of intellectual clarity. He worked long hours, often alone, tinkering with circuits and transformers, testing frequencies and voltages, listening always for the faintest sign of resonance. Yet even as the tower neared completion, the world around Tesla shifted. In 1901, Guglielmo Marconi successfully transmitted the letter S across the Atlantic using a simpler, more economical wireless system. The achievement captured public imagination and investor interest. Newspapers heralded Marconi as the father of wireless, and funds that might once have flowed to Tesla now trickled elsewhere. When Tesla requested additional support from Morgan to complete Wardenclyffe, he was rebuffed. Morgan, ever practical, saw little profit in global wireless power. Tesla, undeterred, pressed on. He modified his equipment, redesigned parts of the tower, and spoke publicly of the potential to transmit not only messages, but music, images, even entire broadcasts of voice and sound. He believed that, once complete, Wardenclyffe would allow communication between continents, not by cables stretched across ocean beds, but through the open air. He even hinted at the possibility of communicating with other planets, though such statements were always couched in speculative tones. The locals watched with a mix of admiration and bemusement. The tower stood like a silent sentinel over the landscape, its purpose mysterious, its workings hidden behind Tesla's discretion. Children would sometimes ride their bicycles past the fence, peering through gaps in the wood to glimpse the strange instruments and quiet figure within. But as the years passed, the dream began to waver. Without further funding, construction slowed, then stopped. The tower stood, complete in form but incomplete in function, its great dome silent. Tesla's creditors began to circle. Bills went unpaid. Suppliers withheld materials. By 1905, Wardenclyffe had become less a site of promise and more a symbol of stalled ambition. Tesla himself grew thinner, more withdrawn. He continued to frequent his favorite hotels, dined alone, and wrote prolifically in his notebooks. His correspondence remained active, filled with ideas and assurances, but the edges of doubt began to creep in. Friends and associates noticed a change, not of character, but of mood. He seemed burdened, not only by financial strain, but by the weight of a vision unfulfilled. In 1915, the tower was quietly dismantled. The copper dome was sold for scrap, the wooden frame pulled down, its parts carted away in silence. There was no ceremony, no statement. Tesla did not attend. He had already retreated into the city, his thoughts turning once more to new concepts, turbines, oscillators, and ever more speculative devices. Wardenclyffe faded into memory, its grounds left to weeds and weather. The buildings remained for a time, then fell into disrepair. But for Tesla, the tower was never truly lost. It lived on in diagrams, in notes, in the silent certainty that he had been, at least in principle, correct. He would never again have such a laboratory, nor would he again command the attention of financiers on the scale of Morgan. But he continued to work, quietly, in hotel rooms and borrowed spaces, sketching the outlines of futures that remained just out of reach. For Tesla, the Wardenclyffe years were not a failure, but a season of proof that even the grandest visions could be translated into form, however briefly. The tower may have fallen, but the idea remained upright, its lines drawn not in timber or steel, but in the invisible architecture of thought. As the second decade of the 20th century began to unfold, the world around Tesla shifted into a faster rhythm, an age of consolidation and industry, of stock markets and standardizations, of corporations growing vast and inventions quickly absorbed into the mechanisms of commerce. For Tesla, the man who once lit the World's Fair and dreamed of towers sending energy through the sky, the pace of modernity began to move past him, not for lack of genius, but because his path was not shaped for profit. After the quiet dismantling of the Wardenclyffe Tower, Tesla entered a long period of financial difficulty. The collapse of the project had not only consumed the last of his major funding, but had left him with lingering debts, contractual obligations, unpaid wages, and loans extended on goodwill and belief. He was by nature generous, reluctant to haggle or pursue wealth with vigor. When money did come, it was often spent as quickly as it arrived, not on luxuries, but on equipment, materials, and renewed attempts to perfect his designs. He moved from the Waldorf Astoria to smaller hotels. By 1917, he had settled at the Hotel Pennsylvania, a respectable but more modest establishment. The rooms were clean, the meals consistent, and the staff, familiar with Tesla's habits, allowed him the quiet he preferred. He paid his bills irregularly, sometimes in parts, and at times fell into arrears, yet he maintained an air of dignity that softened the reluctance of hotel managers to ask for overdue payments. It was during these years that Tesla revisited some of his earlier work, particularly his designs for turbines and bladeless engines. He believed these machines, compact, efficient, and largely misunderstood, held the potential to revolutionize mechanical power. But again, the challenge was not in the invention, but in its adoption. He lacked the capital to build prototypes at scale, and the industrial world, increasingly standardized, had little patience for methods not already proven in commerce. Still, Tesla persisted. He gave lectures, published articles, and filed patents where he could afford to do so. One such lecture, delivered before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in 1917, reflected not the broken figure often imagined in later accounts, but a man still possessed of conviction and poise. He spoke softly, clearly, and with an unhurried logic, outlining ideas that had been with him for decades. To those who listened closely, there was brilliance, though it was now laced with something gentler, a tone of reflection, even of quiet resignation. In the same year, Tesla's contributions were recognized by the Institute, which awarded him the Edison Medal, ironically named for the very man with whom he had once been in unspoken rivalry. Tesla accepted it graciously, but privately the gesture left him ambivalent. The medal represented acknowledgement, yes, but also a kind of closing. His most productive years were now regarded as past. The world, it seemed, had categorized him, honored, but not consulted, remembered, but no longer funded. He lived increasingly within himself, keeping to routines that brought comfort. He walked each day, always at the same hour, along routes chosen for their symmetry and solitude. He fed the pigeons in Bryant Park, speaking softly to them, sometimes with a crust of bread wrapped in paper from his pocket. He found particular solace in one white pigeon, which he claimed visited him regularly, even at his hotel window. He spoke of it not merely as a bird, but as a companion, delicate, intelligent, and, in its own way, radiant. When it fell ill, Tesla nursed it carefully, and when it died, he wept. His later notebooks, increasingly filled with theoretical ideas, contain diagrams of strange devices, death rays, mechanical oscillators, beam weapons powered by stored electrical energy. These inventions, never built, were occasionally discussed in interviews and articles, sometimes with hyperbolic headlines. Tesla, it seems, allowed a measure of mystery to remain. Whether these devices were practical or speculative is still debated, but Tesla himself regarded them as continuations of his lifelong inquiry into energy and its transmission, not weapons, but instruments of deterrence. He wrote long letters during these years, some to friends, others to the editors of newspapers. He commented on scientific developments, on the dangers of unchecked materialism, on the importance of peace. He believed that invention should serve humanity, not control it, and that technology, if rightly applied, could eliminate scarcity and conflict. But his tone was quieter now, more ruminative, like that of a man speaking not to win, but to be remembered clearly. Offers of assistance came occasionally, a small stipend from friends here, a paid article there. He accepted them with humility, always seeking to repay the kindness, if not in coin, then in words or ideas. But the debts lingered. Creditors grew firmer. Some of his belongings were seized. His patents, once valuable, had expired or been outpaced. The financial world, concerned with profit margins and quarterly growth, had little room for the long arc of a solitary mind. Yet through it all, Tesla remained composed. He never begged, never scolded. He continued to dress well, to speak with precision, to hold doors open for strangers. He remained in all things courteous. The quiet dignity that had marked his youth persisted into his twilight. If he felt bitterness, he rarely showed it. If he regretted missed fortunes, he did not dwell on them. In the shadow of debt, he found pockets of peace, in his walks, in his journals, and above all, in the memory of towers that once reached for the sky. The ideas that had once stirred audiences and earned him applause were now pages in drawers, notes in the margins of time. But he believed they still held worth, that perhaps one day someone would find them, read them, and begin again. In the long twilight of his life, when the currents of finance and fame had long ebbed away, Nikola Tesla settled into a quieter existence. His days took on the soft, ritualistic pace of a man who no longer chased the future, but rather moved in steady rhythms through the present, sustained by habit, memory, and a few small joys. Chief among these joys was his daily communion with the pigeons of New York City, and more precisely, those who gathered near Bryant Park. The park itself, nestled behind the grand stone facade of the New York Public Library, was a modest patch of green in the heart of a city growing ever taller and louder. There, among the worn benches and gravel paths, Tesla found a measure of calm. He would arrive often in the early morning or late afternoon, his tall frame wrapped in a long overcoat, whatever the season, a paper bag in hand, its contents soft and crumbling. Bread, cornmeal, or the occasional grain mixture bought especially for his winged companions. He moved slowly, with the kind of gentle deliberateness that animals recognize. The pigeons, unstartled by his presence, would gather as he sat on his usual bench beneath the trees. Some alighted near his shoes, others on the bench beside him, and a brave few upon his outstretched arms. Tesla spoke to them quietly, in the same composed tones he once used to describe rotating magnetic fields and oscillating coils. They did not understand his words, but they responded to the constancy of his voice, the steadiness of his gaze, the absence of fear. To most who passed by, he was merely an old man feeding birds, one of many. Few recognized him, and fewer still recalled the inventor who had once lit the World's Fair, or dreamed of electrifying the globe without wires. He did not mind. Anonymity had become a comfort. Among the pigeons, he needed no explanation, no introduction. They came because he came. That was enough. He began to care for them not merely in passing, but with intention. At times he brought small cloths to clean their feet, and he would sometimes take injured birds back to his hotel room, creating makeshift perches and bedding from folded towels. He observed their behavior with the same attentive gaze he once reserved for electrical phenomena, charting their flight paths, noting their preferences, their temperaments. He spoke of them not as pets, but as friends. There was one in particular, a white pigeon with soft grey markings and eyes the colour of light amber, who seemed to return to him daily. She was elegant in flight, silent in movement, and she allowed Tesla to hold her without flutter or fuss. He claimed, in private conversation and later in interviews, that she had a unique bond with him. "I loved that pigeon," he once said simply. Yes, as a man loves a woman. The phrase, often misunderstood or mocked, was not an expression of eccentricity, but of companionship. She represented to him something unspoken and rare, loyalty without expectation, affection without intrusion. Tesla believed, in a way he could not fully explain, that this pigeon communicated with him, not through words, of course, but through presence, gesture, the tilt of her head, the flick of her wings. He once claimed that she came to his window late at night, that she knew when he was troubled, and that in her gaze he found reassurance. When she fell ill, he spared no effort in her care. He summoned veterinarians, purchased medicine, and sat beside her for hours in the dim hush of his hotel room. When she died, Tesla was devastated. He later described the moment with a soft gravity that startled his few listeners. "Something went out of my life," he said. "Up to that time, I knew with certainty that I would complete my work, no matter how ambitious. But when that pigeon died, something went out of my life. I knew that my life's work was finished." Whether or not the sentiment was literal mattered less than the feeling it conveyed. In that small, fragile creature, Tesla had found the last pure connection in a life otherwise filled with abstract energies and distant ambitions. Her death marked not the end of his ideas, for those continued to evolve, but the closing of a chapter, the last unguarded bond in a world grown distant. Afterward, he continued his walks to the park, but with less frequency. The pigeons still gathered, but his attentions were gentler, less animated. He would sit for long stretches, unmoving, eyes unfocused. The bread remained in his hand, forgotten. The wind stirred the leaves. The city moved on. To the occasional journalist or acquaintance who sought him out, he remained courteous, articulate, and even enthusiastic when asked about his work. He spoke of new concepts, some plausible, others perhaps more symbolic than scientific. He referenced the Earth's energy fields, spoke of wireless networks that might one day circle the globe. But beneath the words was a quieter current, the acceptance that his greatest achievements had already passed, and that the world he had dreamed of was not quite the one that had arrived. Still, there was no bitterness in him, only a kind of tired grace. The pigeons, unknowing, continued to come and go, their wings beating softly in the dusk, like thoughts drifting through a tired mind. And Tesla, seated on his familiar bench beneath the dappled shade of Bryant Park, let the silence deepen, his hands resting gently in his lap, as if he were still waiting for one white bird to return. As the years wore on, Nikola Tesla's world became increasingly confined to the quiet interiors of New York hotels, narrow corridors, high-ceilinged lobbies, and the windowed silence of upper-story rooms that overlooked the city's growing skyline. He moved from one establishment to another, never quite settling for long, his stays defined more by practical necessity than by choice. After his time at the Hotel Pennsylvania and a brief return to the Waldorf Astoria, he took up residence at the Hotel New Yorker in 1933, a grand building in its day with Art Deco fixtures and views that reached across the Hudson River. Tesla's room, number 3327 on the 33rd floor, became his final home. It was modestly furnished. Bed, writing desk, armchair, a small bookshelf, and a narrow wardrobe. A suitcase rested in the corner, and beside it, the wooden box in which he kept his more private papers. The windows faced west, catching the fading light of each day. Here, in the quiet above the city's traffic, he lived with routines so fixed they resembled ceremony. He rose late in the morning, often around noon, and would descend to the hotel dining room where he took his meals at a small corner table. The waiters knew him well. He dined alone, always with a white linen napkin, always with precise silver cutlery, wiped carefully before use. He drank warm milk, sometimes with a roll or a light vegetable plate. His appetite had dwindled, but his manners had not. He addressed the staff with courtesy and spoke little unless spoken to. After dining, he would return to his room, where he would write letters, make notes, or sit in stillness for hours, thinking. He no longer had a laboratory, no longer constructed models or tested theories in metal and wire, but his mind remained active. He thought through equations, imagined new devices, traced the invisible paths of waves and signals through the air. His notebooks from these years contain sketches of turbines, diagrams of resonant circuits, and curious writings on free energy, a concept he never fully defined, but which some took as a continuation of his early wireless power dreams. In these final years, Tesla remained a figure of fascination, if not of influence. Journalists occasionally sought interviews, drawn more by his eccentricities than by his genius. He was described in the press as reclusive, odd, even otherworldly. Some reports fixated on his daily feeding of pigeons, his beliefs about communicating with other planets, or his strict routines. Tesla, for his part, entertained these visits with quiet amusement. He offered cryptic answers, hinted at inventions not yet disclosed, and spoke of energy and vibration with the same poetic certainty that had once filled lecture halls. One such invention, often mentioned but never demonstrated, was what Tesla referred to as a teleforce weapon, a directed energy device that, he claimed, could project a beam powerful enough to bring down aircraft or halt entire armies. He insisted it was not a weapon of war, but of peace, a means of deterrence that would render conflict obsolete. Governments showed passing interest. A few diplomats called on him, but the design was never produced, and whether the concept was feasible remains uncertain. Tesla kept the details close, perhaps because he feared its misuse, or perhaps because the invention existed more in principle than in practical terms. His reputation, meanwhile, drifted into a strange middle ground. Among electrical engineers and scientists, he was acknowledged as a pioneer. His work with alternating current was beyond dispute. His patents, many long expired, had formed the foundation of modern power systems. But to the wider public, he had become a sort of mystery, a man once hailed as the next great mind of the age, now largely absent from its proceedings. Despite this fading, Tesla received small honors. A commemorative dinner was held on his 75th birthday in 1931, organized by the Institute of Electrical Engineers. Messages of praise were sent from across the globe, including one from Albert Einstein. Photographs of the event show Tesla seated formally, dressed impeccably, with a mild smile that does not quite reach his eyes. It was a kind gesture, but it came too late to change the arc of his life. Back at the Hotel New Yorker, the days moved slowly. Tesla continued to write, mostly letters to acquaintances or reflections for himself. He followed the developments of the world with measured detachment. Radio, aeroplanes, new physics theories. He expressed admiration for developments in quantum mechanics, though he preferred his own vision of a universe governed by mechanical harmony and resonance. Visitors became fewer. His surviving friends aged or passed on. He received the occasional guest, a journalist, a curious young engineer, a diplomat, but the meetings were brief. He spoke softly, always formally, and after a time returned to his solitude. He had no telephone in his room. He preferred to write. The hotel staff, though not privy to the details of his past, treated him with a certain reverence. They knew he was not an ordinary guest. They noticed the way he moved, always erect, always unhurried, and the meticulous way he folded his garments, arranged his desk, aligned his shoes. They knew he paid his bills late, but never deceitfully. There was something in his quiet that earned respect. He continued to feed the pigeons, though less frequently. His steps down to the street had grown slower. He carried crumbs in a paper bag, wore gloves in all seasons, and sat for shorter intervals. When asked why he cared so for the birds, he simply replied, "Because I love them. As long as I live, they will be cared for." By the close of the 1930s, Tesla was nearly forgotten in the broader sphere. The world had entered another war. Science and industry had shifted focus. Radar, nuclear energy, and computing had taken center stage. The language of the age had changed. But Tesla remained, high in his hotel room, beneath the quiet whir of ceiling fans and the occasional creak of radiators, dreaming still of frequencies, of silent transmissions, of towers reaching toward the stars. He did not speak of endings. He wrote of future work. He imagined machines that breathed, turbines without blades, messages that traveled without wire, without limit, without delay. He believed that one day the world would come back to his ideas, not to him perhaps, but to the truths he had glimpsed half a lifetime ago in the shadows of coils and the silence of stars. As the 1940s began to unfold and the world once again found itself embroiled in conflict, Nikola Tesla remained alone in his high room at the Hotel New Yorker, far removed from the engine rooms of war and the bustling laboratories of the modern scientific age. He was by then in his 80s, tall still, though thinner, his once dark hair now white and gently receding, his eyes pale and quietly reflective. He had long ceased to travel, his daily movements confined to the hotel, the occasional walk and the solemn descent to the lobby or dining room. Tesla's loneliness was not the loud, anguished kind, but a more subtle solitude, the sort that settles over time like dust on an unused desk. He was not bitter, nor angry, nor even sad in any visible way. Instead, he moved as one who had quietly accepted the shape of his life. The accolades, where they came, were politely received. The neglect, when it arrived, was met with silence. His solitude was complete, but it was not a prison. It had become, over years and decades, a way of being. He no longer worked with machines, nor sought funding, nor published in journals. His laboratory, once filled with light and noise, now lived only in memory. But the mind remained, restless and exacting. He filled notebooks with musings on time, energy, vibration, and thought. Some entries were lucid and precise, sketches of devices or formulae carefully inked in the margins. Others were more abstract, philosophical reflections, fragments of conversations never had, letters addressed to no one in particular. Tesla continued to believe, quietly and without spectacle, that the universe was governed by resonance, that every object, Every force, every living thing vibrated at its own natural frequency, and that harmony could be found if only one learned to listen carefully enough. His ideas, though no longer fashionable, remained internally consistent. He did not follow trends, did not chase consensus. Instead, he remained faithful to the picture of reality he had spent a lifetime assembling piece by piece in solitary thought. Occasionally, he wrote letters to old acquaintances or to distant institutions. They were always composed in elegant script, folded carefully, and posted with deliberate care. Sometimes he would send greetings on his birthday, an annual ritual that had begun in his 70s and continued into his later years. These notes were not celebratory in tone, but rather thoughtful updates, reflections on past work, and suggestions for future inquiry. He rarely received replies, but he did not seem to mind. Journalists still came to call, especially on anniversaries or when a curious editor wished to revisit the eccentric genius of yesteryear. Tesla, ever courteous, would grant interviews. He spoke softly, often from a deep armchair in his room, dressed immaculately in suit and tie. He answered questions with precision, though his thoughts sometimes wandered to places the reporters could not follow. He spoke of death rays, of wireless power, of energy drawn from the fabric of space. His words, though clear, were often met with bemusement, written up in columns that mingled admiration with quiet mockery. But these visits grew fewer. As war deepened in Europe and technology turned to other applications, radar, computing, propulsion, the past seemed distant. And Tesla, once a herald of the future, was now considered an artifact of it. The inventions that bore his name were still in use, of course. Alternating current powered the cities. His coils still stood in laboratories and museums. But the man himself had drifted from the spotlight, his silhouette lengthening in the dusk. He remained precise in habit. Each evening he brushed his clothes meticulously, counted his steps to and from the dining room, and ensured his papers were arranged just so. These small rituals provided continuity. They gave shape to the unstructured hours of his day, and in them perhaps lay a kind of peace, the familiar comfort of repetition in a world that had otherwise moved on. Visitors who did come, an occasional scholar, a devoted admirer, a curious student, often left struck by Tesla's composure. He spoke as though the room around him did not matter, as though he still stood in the center of his laboratory with coils humming and ideas sparking. He did not lament his lack of wealth, nor complain of injustice. He rarely mentioned other scientists. His focus always was on the work itself, on the purity of the idea, the elegance of the solution. And yet beneath the calm there was loneliness. Not for people, perhaps, for Tesla had never been drawn to the noise of society, but for collaboration, for minds that could meet his own on the strange, quiet paths of invention. Most had gone, or grown old, or never existed to begin with. He had always walked a solitary road, but now, at its end, he walked it alone. The pigeons even now offered some comfort. He no longer fed them daily, but they came still to the window ledges, drawn by habit or some lingering scent. He watched them sometimes from his chair, his gaze following their flight with a kind of meditative stillness. In them, perhaps, he saw echoes of thought, movements unspoken, graceful, exact. Tesla's health declined slowly, without drama. He suffered occasional fainting spells, grew frail, and moved with greater care. Yet he insisted on independence. He refused hospitalization, declined offers of assistance, and insisted on paying what he could of his bills, even when funds were scarce. Pride remained, not of the boastful sort, but a quiet dignity, a refusal to surrender what little control he still possessed. The world outside changed rapidly. Planes flew faster, radios filled homes, computers, in their earliest forms, began to whisper of a new era. But within room 3327, the pace was slower. Here, time was measured in thoughts, not hours, in notebooks, not headlines. Tesla, in these final days, did not fade so much as withdraw, like a sound heard at a distance, clear but diminishing. He never married, had no children, left behind no estate, but he left pages, thousands of them, filled with diagrams, dreams, and quiet certainty. He left behind principles too. That invention could be a moral act, that the world was a web of harmonies, and that to listen carefully was to begin to understand. The year was 1943, and January came in on the chill of midwinter, brushing snow against the city's facades and quieting the streets in the early hours. The war overseas was growing in its complexity and cost. Factories bustled with wartime production, young men marched through stations, and radio reports crackled with updates from distant fronts. New York, though alive with motion, seemed at moments to pause, listening, waiting, enduring. And high above the street, in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, Nikola Tesla passed from that world to the next. The room was quiet when they found him, his slender form resting in the bed, his hands loosely folded, his breathing long ceased. The hotel maid had knocked that morning, as she did each day, and when he did not respond, she entered with caution. There was no sign of struggle, no disorder, only stillness. Tesla, it seemed, had slipped away in the soft hush of the night, alone but not afraid, his final hours as undisturbed as the hundreds of solitary evenings that had preceded them. He was 86 years old. Word of his death travelled slowly at first, then gathered momentum. A man who had once shared banquets with financiers and demonstrated lightning before packed theatres had died in obscurity, his hotel bill in arrears, his possessions modest, his work largely forgotten by the general public. Yet, as journalists rediscovered his name and editors pulled from dusty archives the grand headlines of his earlier life, a curious reckoning began. The newspapers carried his obituary with respectful brevity. Nikola Tesla dies, some read. Scientist who pioneered electrical power. Others delved into his more eccentric aspects. His reclusiveness, his theories on death rays, his fondness for pigeons. Few captured the deeper truth of the man who had once dreamed of illuminating the world from a single point, of sending messages through the very bones of the earth, of replacing wires with waves and darkness with the hum of invisible light. The contents of his room were modest, a few suits, carefully folded, a stack of notebooks, letters bound in twine, and a simple wooden chest containing personal effects and technical drawings. The notebooks, in particular, sparked interest. They held, it was said, ideas not yet realized, machines only ever imagined, principles described in ink and margin notes. Some would become the subject of speculation, even myth. Others, quietly stored, would sit unread for years. Shortly after his death, representatives from the Office of Alien Property arrived to seize his belongings. The war had heightened suspicions, and though Tesla was an American citizen, his foreign birth and solitary manner had drawn quiet concern. Government agents catalogued the documents, sealed the boxes, and removed them from the room. The chest of papers was taken to a warehouse in Manhattan, later transferred to Washington, and eventually to storage. Though Tesla had always believed that his work would be a gift to the world, it now sat in boxes. waiting for someone to rediscover it. His funeral, held days later, was modest. A few acquaintances, admirers, and former colleagues attended, along with a handful of curious onlookers. There was no grand procession, no public holiday. A small service was held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and then the city moved on, as cities do. But something lingered. In the quiet aftermath of Tesla's death, a subtle resurgence began. Engineers, scholars, and later historians began to revisit his patents. They traced the origins of radio, of alternating current, of wireless communication, and found, again and again, the faint imprint of his ideas. His name reappeared in footnotes, then textbooks, then headlines. His legacy, once dimmed, began to glow again, not in bursts of light, but in the slow recognition that many of the structures of the modern world had passed, in some way, through his mind. The room itself, room 3327, remained, cleaned, refurnished, eventually re-let, but to those who knew, it was hallowed. Here, beneath soft lamplight and behind thin hotel curtains, Tesla had dreamed until the end. Dreamed not of riches or revenge or fame, but of balance, of beauty, of a world in which energy flowed freely, shaped not by greed, but by understanding. He'd spoken little in his final days. His voice had grown quieter, his gait slower, but he had continued to think, to sketch, to believe. And perhaps, in those final hours, he saw once more the white pigeon at his window, wings outstretched, head tilted, as if offering one last message in silence. He left no estate, no heirs, no foundation bearing his name, only the quiet hum of transformers, the soft glow of electric lamps, the hidden rhythms of resonant frequencies, and the gentle remembrance that sometimes the brightest minds live not in crowds, but in corners, not with acclaim, but with quiet, not with thunder, but with silence. Nikola Tesla had passed from the world he had helped shape, but the current of his thought, invisible yet enduring, flowed on. Time, as it tends to, moved forward without ceremony. The war ended. The city grew taller. Radios gave way to televisions, valves to transistors, wires to microchips. Names came and went in the journals of science and the halls of industry, some celebrated, some forgotten, some reshaped by memory into something else entirely. And somewhere in the quieter margins of that progression, Nikola Tesla's name began to stir once more. Not at first in the headlines or classrooms, but in whispers among hobbyists, engineers, and the curious. A footnote in a textbook, a reference in a patent file, a name spoken softly in the context of great currents and forgotten coils. Then gradually, with the turn of years, came a fuller remembrance, a reassessment, not loud, not immediate, but insistent in its persistence. The world he had imagined in fragments and outlines was beginning to materialize, not exactly as he had foreseen it, but recognizable all the same. Wireless communication had become common. Power grids stretched across continents. Remote control, once a parlor trick to doubtful audiences, governed satellites and machines with ease. Frequencies carried not only voice, but data. Light and sound transformed into digits and transmitted across oceans in seconds. And while many of these advancements bore the names of others, the deeper currents traced back, again and again, to Tesla's notebooks, to his long hours in dark laboratories, to his quiet evenings spent watching pigeons fly across Manhattan's dusk. In the decades following his death, various tributes emerged. Streets were named, statues raised. The unit of magnetic flux density, the Tesla, was adopted in scientific nomenclature. Museums gathered his papers, studied his devices, and reconstructed his ideas with the benefit of modern tools. Wardenclyffe, once left to ruin, was gradually restored by preservationists and supporters who believed that memory, like energy, should not be allowed to dissipate unobserved. The myths grew too. Stories emerged, some grounded, others less so. Tales of suppressed inventions, secret dossiers, free energy devices hidden by governments or corporations. Tesla became, for some, not merely an inventor, but a symbol, a figure onto whom desires and doubts could be projected. In this, as in life, he was both known and misunderstood, admired and appropriated. Yet the truest tribute lay not in myth, but in quiet continuity, in each alternating current that lights a home, in each motor that spins in silent efficiency, in the invisible waves that carry words from one continent to another. These were not just technologies, they were echoes of thought, long, subtle reverberations from a mind that once sat alone in a New York hotel room, drawing lines through silence. For those who took time to read more deeply, to study the man behind the coils and theories, a fuller picture emerged. Not a magician, not a prophet, but a man, sensitive, solitary, precise, whose ideas were often years ahead, and whose temperament did not suit the machinery of fame. He failed, often. He misjudged, occasionally. He was not a businessman, nor a showman, nor one who sought fortune, but he believed, with uncommon clarity, in the possibility of a better world through understanding. He wrote once that the day would come when humanity would cease to regard the forces of nature as enemies and would learn instead to live in harmony with them. That idea, gentle in its phrasing, remained at the heart of his work. Whether in wireless power, renewable energy, or the resonance of the earth itself, Tesla's inquiries were not about dominance, but balance, not about conquest, but comprehension. In the end, he asked for little. His rooms were simple, his meals modest. He left no heirs clamouring for legacy, no dynasty or institute to cement his name. He left instead a trail of ideas, some realized, some not, each one a quiet invitation to look more closely, to listen more carefully, to think more patiently. Today, his memory lives in many forms, in the textbooks of physics, in the names of vehicles and technologies, in the quiet admiration of those who walk the quieter paths of science. But perhaps it lives most poignantly in the image of an old man seated in the soft shadows of a city park, cradling a pigeon in his hands, speaking to it in soft tones, while the world rushed past unnoticed. Nikola Tesla's story, like the frequencies he studied, was not always visible, but it moved through the world nonetheless, subtle, steady, and, in time, enduring. That brings us to the end of Nikola Tesla, a story not of triumph or tragedy, but of the quiet persistence of thought, of one man's life spent mostly in stillness, watching the world not for what it was, but for what it might yet become. Thank you for listening. If you're still with us, perhaps with the room now dim and the evening grown quiet, I hope Tesla's long and solitary walk through the past has brought you some peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and how far you made it through before sleep began to soften the edges of the story. Until next time, rest well. You've earned it. Tonight we'll be following the life of a man both celebrated and, in many ways, forgotten. A quiet figure moving at the edge of the limelight. Nikola Tesla, a name now wrapped in myth and modern reinvention, but once just a boy in a rural village in the heart of the 19th century Habsburg Empire. Long before the debates over electricity and invention, before the towers and lightning, he was simply the son of a priest and a gifted mother, born in a modest household under a crackling sky. Tesla's story is often told through flashes of brilliance and bursts of rivalry, but here we'll draw it slowly, as one might sketch the outline of a quiet stream or trace the patterns in old wallpaper. This won't be a tale of triumph or tragedy, not really. It will be one of slow hours in shadowed rooms, of journals filled with calculations and dreams left unspoken. We'll linger over the ordinary, his long walks, his modest meals, the scratch of a pen on paper, as much as the moments of invention. This will be a journey into silence, into the ticking clockwork of a man who lived between two ages, neither fully of the past nor quite of the future. So let's begin with gentle steps. Our first chapter finds us in a mountain village, as a soft rain begins to fall over the thatched rooftops and the distant sound of thunder murmurs its way through the dark.